thing that I find unique about bird language is that it's kind of like tracking, but rather than looking at tracks on the ground, you're actually listening to sounds that are being made by birds. It's a way to actually tune in with your landscape and learn things about the world by just using your ears and listening. You can actually discern information about bird language from any bird that's within earshot. And I think it actually has the potential to expand the awareness of a person in nature much more out to the edges than something like tracking or just using your eyes to look at plants and trees. The other thing that's really interesting about bird language is that it all happens live. So if you hear an alarm happening somewhere off in the distance in the forest, it's because there's an animal moving around right now. As opposed to like if you see a track on the ground, it's a sign that an animal was here either recently or it might have been here like a while ago, depending on the age of the track. So that's kind of a cool thing when you can merge bird language and tracking together. You can follow the tracks and learn about the animals that are in your area, but then you start hearing alarms and you start to figure out that there's a reflection of the animals that are in that space being broadcast by the birds, and so it enables you to actually get closer to the animals. I would say that one of the biggest barriers to learning bird language is being too quick to make a judgment about what a bird is saying or what a bird is doing. And this is something that I notice a lot when I go out with people who are kind of new to bird language, and they maybe understand the concept that there are times when birds are alarmed and there are times when birds are not alarmed. And by listening for the differences in their voices, you can tell when they're alarmed versus not alarmed. But there's a strong tendency for people to want to label it very quickly. Like they hear a sound and they immediately say, oh, that's an alarm. Or they hear a sound and they say, oh, that's not an alarm. And the thing is that as soon as you start doing that, like as soon as you label something as an alarm or not an alarm, you kind of write it off and you stop listening at that deeper level. And so one of the biggest things that I learned about bird language that has made the biggest difference to me being able to actually tell with confidence whether something is in fact an alarm or whether it's not an alarm is just letting go of that instinct to label it so quickly. Like if you hear a bird make a sound and you say, oh, that sounds like it might be an alarm. Well, it might be an alarm, but if you listen to that sound and it goes on for like a minute and you're still like, oh, that still sounds kind of alarmy, it's more likely that that's an alarm. Now, if that goes on for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you become much more confident that it actually is an alarm. And so I would say that's one of the things that beginners do. Like they listen for the sound of alarm rather than listening for the entire context in which the sound occurs. My favorite thing with bird language is going out into the field and just sitting down and listening and tuning in with what's happening with the birds and feeling the shift in my state of mind as I do that, feeling myself starting to become more peaceful. And then, I hear something off in like the other side of the forest, and just a bird going, and it kind of piques my interest, and I listen, and I notice that it's still going on for a while, and I keep listening. I start to become more and more convinced that there's like an animal back there. It could be like an owl or a raccoon or a cat or something. And then I just, I get the inspiration to go and just explore, and I'm moving towards it, and I start to notice that there's other birds getting involved as well. And eventually, when you get to that place where you walk through the bushes and you see the cat or you see the owl there, it's such an incredible experience because you just used your mind to discover something that to most people would be completely invisible out in nature. And it's so much fun. For me, one of the real benefits of bird language for the average person is that it really teaches you how to think, and it teaches you how to solve problems. Just teaching you how to interact with your environment in a new way and solve problems in a new way by listening and paying attention, using your eyes and ears to grasp information and put it together and see beyond the surface, because bird language is something that goes deeper than the surface. People who want to be more intentional about how they pay attention to the world, people who see themselves as lifelong learners, people who are always looking to push the edge of how they engage with the world and just operate at the highest level of awareness as they move through their life. Those people will really get a lot from practicing bird language, because it builds those skills very effectively. Like, I know when I come back from listening to birds and spending time in birds, I'm much more emotionally clear, I'm much more relaxed, more creative. There's just a real tendency in the world that we live in for people to kind of always be go, go, go with their lives, and not really taking time to invest in their own personal well-being and just having a connection to the world. I think my favorite naturalist skill to teach people is bird language, because it's so accessible. It's it happens everywhere, so there's not really any requirements for being out in a big wilderness area. It happens in the city, it happens in the desert, it happens on the ocean side, and you're not dependent on like finding tracks on the ground or anything like that. And the other cool thing about it is that birds are alive. They're like a living creature, and so that often has a draw for people, and sometimes it's easier for people to get inspired about birds than to get inspired about trees or any kind of like stationary part like geology, rocks. I had someone she had even done introductory courses in bird language. She had a lot of experience in the field with people who were talking about bird language, and she understood the theory of there's songs and there's companion calls and there's alarm calls and territorial aggression. She understood the theory, but she didn't know how to actually make that practical and apply it to actually going outside and finding animals with bird language or using it to enhance her tracking skills. And so we did 8 sessions on Skype. And by the second and third session, she was just so much more tuned in. She was hearing hawks out her window from bed in the morning just by listening to the alarms, and she was starting to tune into the patterns that were telling her about cats that were moving through, and just all these things opening up very fast. I wish that someone had told me that the ability to understand what the birds are saying is not just about the sound that they're making. It's not just about a song versus a call versus an alarm, all that kind of stuff. It's really more important to be tuned in with the context and everything from the kind of landscape that you're in to the historical activities of birds, like how they typically behave on that landscape. And when you hear something that sounds like it might be an alarm, don't be so quick to call it an alarm or to try and disprove it. Just keep listening and pay attention for patterns that happen over a longer period of time. You're looking for patterns over a period of 30 minutes and an hour and a half. And so don't get so stuck in the details, because the details don't always have that much information. Birds will even make the exact same sound in an alarm situation as when they're in a non-alarm situation. So it's not always that's not really where the power of bird language is. It's more in how you can take the information in and coalesce it and produce an idea about what's happening, produce a theory about what's happening, and then research that theory, test your theory, and if you do that, it's really like applied science, and you're applying science without the use of any tools. You're just using the tools of your mind and the tools of your five senses. The other advice that I would give to people who are wanting to get into bird language is, find someone who already knows how to do it. And, the more time that you can spend with people who have real experience, learn from people who have real experience, read every book you can get your hands on, that's all just going to help you embody the right attitude and think about things in the same way that someone who already is proficient with the skill thinks about it. So it's kind of that mentoring piece too. It was definitely a journey that I went on before I could find owls on a consistent basis by listening to bird language. I would say it took me at least a couple years of listening to birds and just paying attention to what they're doing before I really figured that out. A big part of the reason I believe why it took me so long to do that, and this is one of those things that I wish, I wish I had known starting out, is that like where I was studying bird language most of the time in my backyard, in order to find an owl, you have to be able to investigate the alarms that you hear happening off in the distance. Oftentimes it's like way off in the distance, and it's the loudest bird in the forest that's calling. And so you have to be able to travel quite some distance in order to investigate that kind of stuff. And so I was spending a lot of time just sitting in my backyard and listening, and I was even looking back on it now, I would hear alarms happening, but they'd be like a few houses down, and I just wouldn't be able to see what was happening over there. I wouldn't be able to actually go over there and investigate to actually find what was happening. So it wasn't until I really started getting out in the deep forest right around dusk, when the birds and the owls have that period of overlap in their activity, that I really started to get a handle on the owls. I think if I had known that was the approach that you're supposed to take if you want to have a better chance of finding owls with bird language, I think I would have got it much faster. But figuring all that kind of stuff out, it took a while. This one time I was outside sitting in this field, and it was near a big leaf maple tree, and there was grass around in this field, and I kind of looked into an alder stand of little, not very old trees, just like a new planting of alder, and I started hearing these alarms happening in various points of the landscape. This animal came up from the creek, and at first, I heard some rustling in the bushes, and I was like, oh, awesome, I'm gonna get to see this animal. And I thought it was a deer because it was making so much noise. Something small wouldn't necessarily rustle the bushes as much as that animal did. And it ended up being a female mountain lion. And so it was a moment that really got my heart pumping, just seeing a big cat just a little ways in front of me in this alder stand. I actually got up from that spot a few minutes later, and I was just walking back to the house when I got to this point in the trail where it turns, and I looked back towards the house, and another mountain lion walked by with another one right on its tail. So there were two younger cats that she was moving with, and they were basically like on both sides of me at that time. And it was just a rare experience, something that not a lot of people experience. Another time, I was walking on the Olympic Peninsula, and we were just on this trail that led from the campsite moving out to the ocean. We were going to spend some time at the beach, just checking out the different sites on the shore. We were coming back, and the group that I was with, we had kind of spread out along the trail, and so I was actually alone at the time. I was working on moving quietly, just pulling in my area of disturbance so I wasn't causing so much noise, and I was listening really carefully, and I started hearing these alarms up ahead from varied thrush, this kind of like sound, this like popping sound. So I'm on this boardwalk, and the area around it is a little bit marshy, and I look up ahead, and there's this big mama black bear walking out on the trail, and I just like stop. I'm like, oh man, there's a big bear there. It was a huge bear. I started like hearing rustling, like actually right off to the right in the bushes, that I started hearing something else. There was another animal there, and I was like, oh man, I hope that's not like bear cubs. And I'm like getting in between the mom and her bear cubs. And so I was like, well, I'm just gonna back up a little bit. She hadn't seen me there yet, and so I was just backing up, and I actually stepped off the boardwalk with my foot unintentionally, and I like fell off the boardwalk and made this crazy noise, and the bear just like ran off into the bushes. So that was kind of a fun little moment. Made a funny story. A lot of my favorite moments of connection are just, being outside in summertime when there's crickets and a nice hot sun, and I can just be relaxed and just lie there, especially when there's no insects around. It's just really comfortable being there, and I can just close my eyes, and it's just something really peaceful about doing that. My favorite bird is probably the junco, and it could be like the slate-colored junco that we have here, or the dark-eyed junco out on the west coast. And I think the reason I like that bird is because it's very common, at least in the part of the world where I spend time, and it spends a lot of time on the ground, so it's often very tuned in with predators that are on the ground, like cats or raccoons, and it also pays attention to owls and things like that. So it's a really good bird language bird, and it's also like, it's not the most obvious bird in the world. Like, a lot of people will notice the robin or the blue jays or the crows. Those are always the birds that people notice, the jays and the crows. But if you really want to go get some depth with bird language, it's important to look as well at the soft voices, like the juncos, and they do their little companion calling, their feeding calls when they're on the ground, just off in the bushes. And most people don't really notice them there, but they'll be feeding there, and if you can really get your ears to tune into that, and that was really how I trained myself to listen, was listening to the juncos. They'd be off in the bushes, and I'd just be out there closing my eyes and just trying to count every single time that they would call back and forth. They'd be like zzz, zzz, zzz. And you'd notice how they call back and forth like 20 times, and then suddenly they get really quiet, and they're quiet for like 10 seconds, and then they'll start calling again. And those are the sorts of rhythms where you start to notice, and maybe that pattern goes on for like 5 minutes, and then they twitter away and they make all this noise, and you notice that the robins are changing their behavior too, and so that's an indicator that something has shifted on the landscape. If you are someone who wants to go deeply into nature and just explore nature on a level that goes beyond the surface, where it's not just a basic connection to nature. That's like the whole goal of everything that I do, is just to really help you get those skills and have a really practical experience. If you want to learn more about the work that I do and the options that I have for learning about nature, just go to my website at naturementor.com.